Okay. So, well, good morning, and thank you all for your time and interest in participating in this active transportation and complete streets workshop. It's great to see that we have a diverse group as well, representing multiple disciplinary backgrounds. So we're glad to have you here together. I'd also like to express a special thank you to Stephanie Yezzi, Johnson City Planning Director, and Josh Holland, the Johnson City Director of Public Services, who contributed significantly in organizing this workshop. And before we start, I want to mention a few housekeeping items for the webinar. First of all, if you could please keep yourself muted during the presentation, that would help us avoid any unnecessary background noise or feedback. And then also to keep on schedule, we will have a question and answer time at the end of the presentation, towards the end of the workshop. And I do encourage everyone to type in your questions into the chat box as they come to mind. And I'll be monitoring that chat box, and we'll address the questions in there during the Q&A time. Also, a PDF version of the presentation, as well as a link to the recorded version of the workshop, will be emailed out to everyone who registered after the workshop. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our workshop facilitator, Dan Sirachi. We're glad to have Dan back with us, as he's provided complete streets training for us in Endicott during 2019 and online last year. And Dan is the founder and principal of Urban Cycling Solutions Incorporated, and is a nationally recognized expert on equitable mobility solutions and active connections to transit. Working in collaboration with more than 30 agencies across the country, Dan led the development of the American Public Transportation Association's National Guide for Bicycle and Transit Integration. And his multidisciplinary portfolio includes projects ranging from the development of the curriculum we're using today, the New York State's first active transportation and complete streets training curriculum. He's also done a pilot wayfinding system in New York Penn Station, and a feasibility study of an extension of the Empire State Trail along in Long Island. So, and outside the office, Dan is an avid cyclist and instructor of safe riding practices. So Dan, we're glad to have you with us, and I'll turn things over to you at this time.
Thanks so much, Scott, and thanks for having me back. It's been really great diving into Johnson City, and at least from a visual sense, getting to see what the community's like. Obviously, I'm not on the ground, but from what I can see, there's a lot of exciting things happening. There's a lot of great local flavor that I hope this training will help us sort of augment. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to placemaking. But that said, we're really excited to bring this training to Johnson City. As Scott mentioned, this is the state's first official curriculum around active transportation and complete streets for geared towards municipal planning boards, public officials, and like DPW city staff. But since COVID, we've been doing these webinars online. Typically, it's a workshop in person, but we do the best we can with this. The curriculum you're seeing was originally developed by NYSERDA, and we are able to provide these workshops for free thanks to the support of the Department of Health. To date, we've done, I think, more than 30 of these throughout the state. So really excited to spread the word and talk about complete streets and how it can impact communities in different ways. That said, today we're going to cover a pretty wide variety of topics, including just general overview of what complete streets and active transportation is. We're going to talk about infrastructure and what complete streets actually looks like, and then how you prioritize different design solutions. We're going to talk about integrating different transportation systems together. Then we're going to talk about policy and how we identify good policy measures. And then we're going to finish up by talking about implementation and performance management / evaluation. So why don't we dive right in? Before I begin, I want to put this disclaimer out there. So I know there's a lot of people on the call. All of you are coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives as it relates to transportation, as it relates to the streetscape, and your general professional and or personal focus areas. So you may have a different understanding, if you have one at all, of what Complete Streets is. And I want to put a disclaimer out there right off the bat. I am not here to figure out how to get rid of all your parking and put in bike lanes and all of those things. That's not what Complete Streets is about. The goal of this training is to work with you to figure out how we can transform our most abundant public spaces, which are the street, and transform them into safe economic development drivers in our community that foster higher public health outcomes. So we're hitting a lot of notes there, but at the end of the day, we need to remember that streets, even though they're typically used just for car traffic, are not, we pay for them with our tax dollars, right? So they are by nature public spaces just as much as any park, library, school, etc. So it's up to us to figure out what the highest and best use of that public space is for our communities based on the things that we prioritize in any given area. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Yes, there are a lot of tools to achieve those outcomes, right? There, bike lanes, curb extensions, shutting down streets, moving parking, etc. These are all different tools in our toolkit, but at the end of the day, that's a means, not an end. The end are whatever the goals are that you're prioritizing as Johnson City. And that can look different in different parts of the city, right? So on the main street, it's going to look very different than it might, say, in a less dense area. So that's my disclaimer. We're going to kick things off now with the general overview of what these things are. And we're going to put a finer point on what I just said as we talk about developing design solutions in the next module. So the first obvious question here is, what is active transportation? Well, active transportation is any self-propelled, human-powered mode of transportation, such as walking or bicycling. And what's interesting here is not so much this definition, because it's fairly straightforward, it's where this is coming from. So you see that this is a definition from the Center for Disease Control. So you might be asking yourself, wait, I thought we were talking about transportation today, and we are, but the CDC has a very keen interest in active transportation because physical inactivity is a lead contributor to a lot of chronic health conditions in the United States. And part of the reason, as you'll see, that these things tie together is because we spend tons and tons and tons of time in our cars, whether we're going to work, the grocery store, just going out somewhere. The car is the predominant mode of transportation in the United States. And active transportation is a potential solution to getting people out of their cars. Now, if we zoom in on any of these public health issues, specifically obesity, we find that there are real, this is a real crisis, both in New York State and beyond. Here in New York State, in a 10-year period from 1997 to 2016, the percentage of adults categorized as overweight or obese jumped from just over 40% to 60%. And what this means in terms of cost, according to a 2011 study by the New York State Comptroller, childhood obesity accounted for $327 million in annual healthcare spending from the state. And adult obesity was attributed to $11.8 billion in healthcare and related costs from the state budget. So, I go into a lot of communities and, we have good conversations about complete streets, but, I hear, oh, we can't afford this. But when I see numbers like this and we recognize that active transportation might be a solution to getting more active, I say we can't afford not to start thinking about these things. So as I mentioned, we are spending a lot of time in our cars. And in fact, over the years, we've been spending more and more time in our cars. So you can see here from 2006 to 2019, commute times are just getting longer and longer and longer all over the country. And this is due to a variety of factors. There's sprawl, there's population growth, there's poor state of good repair. But the bottom line is that our day-to-day commutes are getting longer, which is forcing us to be in our cars more and more and more. And in New York State, this does bear out. So this is, according to 2019, this was the share of different types of transportation happening across New York State. And you see more than half of New Yorkers are driving to work. Now, this is a little bit misleading because you see almost 30% of New Yorkers commuting via public transit. Well, that's because this graph includes the New York metro area and New York City in particular, where we know that more than 73% of New Yorkers use public transportation as their primary mode of transportation. If you cut out the 5 boroughs of New York City, this orange slice would be in the 70s or 80s. And in the more rural areas of the state, you'd be at almost 100% driving alone. So combine these two thoughts here, right? So our commute times are getting longer and most people are driving. So this is a problem, right? Our goal here should be to think about ways that we can minimize car trips. And that's not to say that, I want to take cars away and I want to make it harder for people to drive. No, but what we do want is to make it just as easy to pick up your car keys in the morning as it is to grab a bike lock or to grab a transit pass. You should have free, flexible choice to take any number of modes of transportation based on what works best for you. Right now, in a lot of areas in New York State, driving is really the only option. So how can we change that? Well, active transportation might be a solution, but there are a lot of reasons that people don't want to do these things, right? So whether it's dangerous, wide intersections that make it difficult for pedestrians to cross, whether it's a lack of safe infrastructure for walking and biking, whether it's state of good repair and potholes, congestion, there's so many reasons that we as commuters might not immediately think of biking and or walking to work. And a lot of these things are not unfounded. So if we look at traffic safety data in New York State from 2012 to 2021, what we see not only is a relatively high number of pedestrian fatalities and pedestrian injuries, but we see a general plateau. We're not seeing any big increases we're not seeing any big decreases in the number of fatalities and injuries. The caveat to that is COVID. So if you look here, and I'm talking strictly about the blue line, which is indicative of pedestrian fatalities and injuries, in 2020, we saw a huge drop in pedestrian injuries. And the reason for that is because people were driving, everybody was home. People were driving less, people were out less. So there were less injuries. Now, of course, as things started to open up again in 2021, we started to see that spike up again. Now, if we look at fatalities and injuries for bicyclists, I think what concerns me most is that this is a pure plateau, right? We're not seeing any change in the number of bicycle fatalities. And if you look at injuries, we're plateaued again, but we're starting to see a rise. Again, if we think about COVID, we know that more and more people started biking during COVID. And as a result, we're also seeing more injuries, which is not good. So this data really does support a lot of those barriers that we perceive to bicycling, walking, and smaller scale modes of transportation. And if we zoom in and we think about where these fatalities are taking place, specifically where pedestrian fatalities are taking place, we find that a quarter of them are taking place at intersections. And when I see that, that's an indicator for me that we have a design problem with our intersections in New York State. So what do we do about that? Well, that's where Complete Streets comes into play. Complete Streets are streets that are designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. What that means is if we do Complete Streets well, we are hitting, or we're checking all the boxes, right? Complete Streets increase safety for all users, including drivers. Complete Streets are more environmentally friendly, and we think about things like runoff and shade and those types of things. If we do Complete Streets well, we're addressing these issues and we're creating lower impact streetscapes. With Complete Streets, as I said earlier, we're optimizing transportation choices. So it's just as easy for anyone to take any particular mode, whether it's transit, whether it's driving, whether it's biking. You're able to do those things. You're not just stuck with a car. If we're doing Complete Streets well, we're ensuring equal mobility for all, regardless of age or ability. Complete Streets enhance livability of our places. So these are places that if we do Complete Streets well, we're creating a streetscape where people want to live, work, and play. We are working toward better public health outcomes. We're increasing economic vitality. And we're making sure that the streetscape serves everyone equally. And you're not disadvantaged if you have limited access to a car. So Complete Streets is also about efficiency. Remember when we kicked things off, I talked about the highest and best use of public space. And I think that this is a really strong visual of how this can work. So if you look at different modes and you consider how much physical space they take up, it's very clear that there are more efficient modes of transportation. So take a look here. This is a bus load of people, and you can see how much space that busload of people takes up on the roadway. Similarly, if you take that same busload of people and you put them on bikes, this is how much space they take up on the roadway. If you take the busload of people and you put every single one of them in cars, suddenly there is no space left on this roadway for any other uses. And we're also creating a more congested streetscape. So this is much less efficient than this. As I said from the beginning, my goal here is not to, get rid of all this and get everybody on the bus and a bike. We're never going to get rid of cars. Cars are integral to our transportation system. What I'm proposing is if we can take half of these car trips and enable them to take other modes, whether it's transit or bicycling, consider that from a spatial standpoint. Suddenly, you could get rid of 2 full car lanes, and you could use that space for any number of things. They could be transit priority lanes. They could be protected bike lanes. This is a pretty wide sidewalk to begin with, but you could think about things like bike corrals, additional street seating, all sorts of different things that you can't otherwise do if every single person here is in a car. So again, what is the highest and best use of our public space, and how can we optimize the way that space is used to maximize different opportunities? From an environmental standpoint, transportation accounts for the highest share of carbon emissions in New York State at 34%. So again, if we can provide alternatives to driving, we can start to chip away at this percentage. From an equity standpoint, owning a car is pretty expensive. This is 2015 data, so I definitely need to update this, but In 2015, the annual cost of owning an automobile was calculated by AAA at $8,500 between parking, insurance, maintenance, gas, etc. And that was expensive back then. Today I'm sure we're at or above $10,000 a year. Um, and if you're living at or below the poverty line, that is a huge roadblock. If you're dependent on a car to get to work or to, access healthy food, get to school, etc. So it's really important that we provide alternatives to driving. I mentioned placemaking earlier. Again, it's about creating healthy spaces that people want to hang out in. So things like street seating for restaurants, thinking about public plazas and parks and making sure that they're vibrant and full of plants and shade and things of this nature. That's what placemaking is about. It's about figuring out, what is uniquely Johnson City and how do we accentuate that. So when people come here, they know where they are and they want to keep coming back. Freight mobility, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about this today, but it is super important to think about this, right? Because we all have stores in our communities and they all need to get their goods from somewhere. So the essential idea here is how do we minimize impacts from freight movement in our community, right? You don't want a tractor trailer truck parked in the middle of your main street or double parked on your main street holding up traffic, right? So how do we reroute truck traffic or consider alternative delivery methods in our community? And to round things out for this introduction, I want to introduce the town of Hamburg. For those of you that aren't familiar, this is a town in Western New York that saw decline after the collapse of the steel industry and the opening of a nearby mall. This main street sort of started to shrivel on the vine. In 2001, New York State DOT decided that they were going to do a quote unquote roadway improvement. And I put that in quotes because the plan was to remove some sidewalks and add a lane of traffic. This would have destroyed street trees, shortened sidewalks, not great things for the community. So the community band together, they created a citizens advisory group, they hired a consultant, and they came up with an alternative design, which was ultimately adopted by DOT and implemented in 2009. Now, what did this design alternative look like? Well, at either end of the 1 mile stretch of Main Street, which you see here, they installed roundabouts. They also added street trees and included these, what they called then safety lanes. This was before bike lanes were part of the urban design lexicon, really. So they added bike lanes, they shortened the travel lanes, and they added mid-block crossings throughout this 1 mile stretch. And the results speak for themselves. In 2010, 1 year after implementation, accidents fell 66% on this main street. The number of building permits increased from, I think it was 9 in 2005 to what was it, 16 in 2010, 1 year after the implementation. And there was a lot of civic activity that cropped up on the streets. There's a soapbox derby, there's garden walks. This stuff works. I mean, these numbers are real. So this is Complete Streets in action. This is what it can look like. And these are the benefits that you might see. So having said that, that's kind of the overview of Complete Streets. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how we start to develop design ideas, how we prioritize different street treatments, and then we're going to sort of rummage through our toolbox of design tools and see what's out there. One thing I am going to do, because my computer is heating up, I am going to pause my video, but I'll pop back on a little later when we do the Q&A. Okay, let's talk about complete street infrastructure. Okay. So the first step when we're thinking about complete street design is recognizing different patterns in our community. So how do we do this? Well, think about sort of those implicit things out there, like goat paths. For those that aren't familiar, this is a goat path. It's basically an evidence of informal travel. And these might be shortcuts because they're more efficient, or maybe people don't feel safe taking the regular route. So naturally over time, they create these informal routes that we can find evidence of. These are worth studying. I mean, this is about creating safe environments that people feel comfortable in. So if people are taking one particular route over another, maybe there's something to that we should be paying attention to. If you're interested in building out your bike network, obviously talking to bikers is a really important indicator. Bikers are really good at route selection and finding comfortable routes wherever they need to go. So, understanding why bikers take certain paths and don't take other paths is really valuable, because if you're trying to make a street more bike friendly and bikers aren't currently using it, we want to understand what those factors are that are driving that decision making. Every community that I've ever been to has, plans or, whispers of projects that never came to fruition. Hey, they've been talking about turning that into a trail since the 70s, or, oh, that intersection's always a problem. Well, there's something to these, right? They stick around in the public consciousness for a reason. So we should be thinking about the realities and, why are people still talking about this? And then most importantly, where are our kids hanging out? So, we want to make sure that our parks, our schools, our libraries, anywhere else that kids go are super safe to walk and or bike to. Kids are vulnerable users, and we need to make sure that the routes they're taking are as safe as possible. So once we've identified some of these needs or patterns in our community, how do we choose the right design? Well, I like to think about this like a step ladder, a prioritized modal step ladder. And what that means is thinking about the different modes of transportation that we want to use in any given land use context. So on Main Street in Johnson City, maybe we want to prioritize walking, biking, and transit over other modes of transportation. In which case, there's an entire menu of design tools that go with each of these modes of transportation. So with walking, thinking about our sidewalks, crosswalks, different kinds of wayfinding, streetscaping, etc. Biking, bike lanes, protected lanes, trails. We're going to talk about some of these things. But essentially, when you prioritize these different modes, it's a way to sketch out how you're going to prioritize different investments and what types of tools you want to apply in a given land use. Now, I'm not speaking for you. I'm not saying this is what you should be doing on Main Street. Maybe transit isn't really feasible. I don't know the specifics. Maybe you don't have a lot of taxis or TNCs. Fine. The point here is that you should be thinking about the step ladder and how you want to organize these different steps to achieve your goals. And bear in mind, this step ladder is going to look very different on Main Street than it is, say, in a less dense area of Johnson City. But I do think that this exercise is really helpful in getting that conversation started and thinking about what those infrastructure investments should be in a particular area. Now, if you leave today with a soundbite, I think this is it. Correct design invites correct use. So what does this mean? Essentially, what we're trying to avoid is this. So there's no markings on the street, no curb. This gentleman here, he can cross and jaywalk wherever he wants because there's no real clear crossing. Meanwhile, drivers have just open blacktop. So there's no real clear lane positioning. This can facilitate speeding. You know, there's just ambiguity, and ambiguity breeds unpredictability, and our streets need to be predictable in order to be safe. So contrast this sort of Wild West scenario with this. This is a really clearly delineated intersection. You know where the lane starts and ends. You see where pedestrians are supposed to be crossing. You have very clear curb cuts and landings where people are making a transition from the sidewalk to the street. So someone using this roadway is going to be far more likely to cross at this intersection rather than jaywalk. And similarly, a driver is going to be more likely to actually be in a particular lane in this scenario because there are street markings. So now we're going to start to rummage through the toolkit right now. And the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of a road diet. So for decades, America has invested in its roadways and making space for cars. And this goes back to, you know, the baby boomer era, everybody, you know, moving to suburbs and getting cars. So the natural thinking was, well, we should be creating more space as more people are driving. Well, the challenge with this investment is that in order to facilitate more car traffic, we built roadways that were designed for cars and not for pedestrians, bicyclists, and other modes of transportation. And the roadways we've designed are wide. They're really wide intersections to give more space to cars. And the wider the crossing, the more dangerous an intersection feels and the less likely someone is to use that crossing as a pedestrian or be encouraged to try a different form of transportation. The bottom line is, and what we've learned in the last 20 years of urban design, is that cars really do not need all that space. We don't need, you know, 15-foot lanes on a roadway. So the concept of a road diet is to shorten or take some space out of these lanes to enable other uses. So if you have, you know, a 12 or a 15-foot lane, you can shorten that and create space, say, for a bike lane or an extended sidewalk or additional parking even. The other reason that road diets are really important is that they tend to slow down traffic speed. And studies have shown us that the slower that vehicles are going, the more likely it is that you will be, as a pedestrian, you will be able to walk away from a collision. So you see this data here. I think somebody's unmuted. You see, you know, if you're hit by a car at 40 miles per hour, there is more than likely you're not going to walk away from that collision as a pedestrian. But if you lower the speed 30 miles per hour, we cut that almost in half. So, you know, you are more than likely, well, I wouldn't say more than likely, but you're, you know, there's a 50% chance of an injury and a 5% chance that you're not going to be injured at all. But 10 miles per hour slower, there is only a 5% chance of a fatality. And you are more than likely going to be okay. So slowing down traffic speed saves lives. And the reason that cars tend to slow down is because with less space, drivers tend to be more careful. You know, there's more stuff going on the roadway more likely. And we've seen this in study after study. Narrower lanes do slow down traffic speed. Now, here's a good example of a road diet and how this can be operationalized. You see before, wide open street, no clear delineation. So here's a car that's close to the double yellow. Here's one that's more sort of center lane. Lots of space here between the moving cars and the parked cars. Well, we don't need all this space. So if we just create a clear delineation between that travel lane and the double yellow, we can create a bike lane on either side. So you see here, open road, other uses, more clear delineation. Here's an example from New York City. Again, you see really wide crosswalk, faded bike lane, you know, and then the result here, we've got curb bump outs, we have a protected bike lane, we have a shorter crossing for pedestrians, and for drivers, we have much clearer delineation on the roadway as to what your turning position should be depending on where you're going. So let's talk a little bit about sidewalks. So in I say urban, but I should say downtown context. So Main Street in Johnson City, our sidewalks might look like this. We've got an edge zone where the street meets the sidewalk. You might have things like parking meters in this area. Maybe, you know, maybe you have a newspaper stand, or not a newspaper stand, but you know, one of those newspaper boxes. I don't know if they still have those. Maybe you have like a mailbox. But this is important because this is how pedestrians make the transition from the roadway to the street. Furnishing zones, you might find things here like street trees. Maybe if there's a restaurant, there's some street seating. Your throughway zone is where people are walking. And then you have a building frontage zone. Again, maybe there's street seating. Maybe you have some products for sale outside of a business. You know, again, the sidewalk isn't just a place for walking. It's a really complex place with different uses depending on where you are. In a more rural context, we have a similar sort of breakdown. So you still have that edge zone, but now you have a curb or planter zone. So maybe you have grass here and trees. You're not going to really have seating here necessarily. You still have that throughway zone where people are walking. And then you have a frontage zone, which could be someone's lawn. It could be a retaining wall, and can look very different. So again, thinking about our sidewalks, not just as concrete for walking, but diverse spaces with different uses depending on where you're standing. Now, in some areas, in more rural areas, sidewalks everywhere might not make a lot of sense. So something like a shared use sidewalk or side path or shared use path makes more sense because you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck. Different users can use this almost like a trail. You can use it as a biker, you can use it as a pedestrian. This is a picture that I took in Rome, New York, and they have a beautiful network of these shared use sidewalks all over some of their more sprawled areas. Now, the one thing with shared use paths or side paths is figuring out the transitions between on and off-road infrastructure. So here you see an example of that where, you know, for cyclists going back into the roadway, you want to make sure there's a transition into this shoulder and or bike lane. Similarly, getting off, you want to make sure that you have a clear path to get onto this side path from the opposite end of the street. Now, for these pedestrians here, I'm assuming there's some, you know, this diagram is illustrative, obviously. So I would assume that there would be something here and a reason for these pedestrians to be crossing here, but that's beside the point. Needless to say, transitions are very important when we're thinking about these side paths. So continuing to rummage through our toolkit here, curb extensions are a really important tool in our toolkit. These essentially shorten the crossing from one sidewalk to another, making it safer for pedestrians. But what drivers don't realize is that curb extensions also provide protection for their parked cars. So you see here, these cars, you know, where before, let's say they were parked all the way up here to the crosswalk, that would open these cars up to vulnerability from turning vehicles and sideswiping. Whereas here, now a car, in order to make this turn, has to do a 90-degree turn onto this roadway, completely avoiding any interaction with these parked cars. So for those who don't like the idea of curb extensions, because it may impact parking capacity, I say, well, would you rather have your car safe or, you know, I think there are benefits all around to be had here. That's what I have to say. There are many ways to do curb extensions. You can do them in concrete like you see here, or you can do them in just paint. This is an example from New York City. And what we see here is that this is such a large curb extension that it's actually become public space. You know, you see people sitting here, you see some bikes parked here, and this is literally just paint with some planters and, you know, big blocks. So curb extensions don't need to be expensive, and they don't necessarily need to be permanent. One other note on curb extensions, I want to bring up this concept of intersection daylighting. So if you have parking that butts up against a crosswalk, you're creating dangerous circumstances for drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists on the roadway because you can't see. So using curb extensions, if you're able to push parking away from the intersection just a little bit, that means that drivers that are coming up on an intersection can see everything in their path, whether it's a pedestrian coming up to the crosswalk or another car trying to make a turn. That's really important. Similarly, pedestrians have a full view of what's going on. Whereas if you're about to cross the street, but there's a parked car directly next to you, you have to sort of walk into the roadway and peek your head out in order to see whether there's oncoming vehicles. So again, this is the concept of daylighting an intersection, which, you know, is another benefit of a curb extension. Speed bumps, you know them. You might not love them, but they are effective in slowing down vehicular speed in particular areas. You can have temporary solutions like this bolted into the asphalt, or you can have, you know, more permanent structures in concrete or asphalt like you see here. The key with speed bumps is making them as visible as possible, and that includes both reflective paint on the actual bump and regulatory signage in advance so drivers know that they have to slow down. Crosswalks are super important. You know, the key with good crosswalks is making them as short as possible for pedestrians, and also making them as visible as possible for all roadway users. There are a lot of ways to do both things. So in order to shorten this crosswalk, for example, so this looks like it was a crosswalk from a trail to a sidewalk, and it may have been diagonal at some point, but by putting in the center median here and creating perpendicular crosswalks, yes, there are two crosswalks now, but they are much shorter than one single crosswalk that connected this to this. As far as visibility goes, this particular crosswalk has rectangular rapid flashing beacons that are pedestrian actuated. So, you know, there are a lot of ways to do this. There are a lot of ways that you can spend money on this. You know, you would be okay with signage and high visibility paint, but you know, there are lots of tools out there that you can use to make an intersection visible. And just as an example of sort of the high end, this is a crosswalk in Spain. There are LEDs embedded in the pavement. So basically, this is pressure sensitive. When you step on the crosswalk, these lights come on and drivers have to yield. When you step off, after a couple seconds, these blink and then turn off. But again, this is a higher end solution. And this is something you'd probably want to focus on in higher density areas if you were to do something like that. So parking is on every community's mind, and there are a lot of considerations when it comes to parking and a lot of different types of car parking. So parallel parking, you're all familiar with this. You know, a key with parallel parking is making sure there's enough space and clearly delineating them. I think one of the things I saw in Johnson City and surveying things is that you guys did a really great job on Main Street delineating parking stalls. So you don't have any of this, New York City garbage where, somebody's parked too close and you're sort of nudging back and forth to get in and out of the spot. It's very clear where cars are supposed to be parked. And, if there's no spot, there's no spot. That creates a lot less dangerous conditions. There is angled parking as well, but this is becoming less and less popular, and most communities that I've been to have started removing this because it's just not safe. And if you've ever parked in an angled parking spot, you know this. When you are pulling into the spot, it's great. It's very convenient. But when you are pulling out, you have zero visibility behind you. Whereas now what we're seeing in lieu of angled parking is called reverse angled parking. And the idea here is instead of pulling into the space, you back into the space. And you see an example of that here. What's great about this is that you get the same space saving benefits that you would with angled parking, but drivers have 180-degree visibility when they are pulling out of the stop. So you can see cars, bicycles, pedestrians as they're coming up, rather than sort of hoping and praying that you're not going to hit anybody as you're pulling back. The one thing with angled parking that's really critical is making sure that A, you educate the community about this before you do it, so they're not surprised, and B, you have very strong, very visible regulatory signage. So every regulatory sign I've ever seen for reverse angle parking is some version of this, where it actually has like a little car symbol and a 1, 2, 3, so that drivers know how to use the parking. So I'm going to shift now into bike infrastructure. Protected bike lanes are sort of the tippy top when it comes. Well, let me. The caveat here is that an off-street trail is the best protection for cyclists. But on our municipal roadways, that's not an option, right? So the highest level of protection we can get on the roadway for cyclists is a protected bike lane. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but the basic concept is to physically separate cyclists from car traffic. And you see a couple examples of that here. In New York City, where this was pioneered in the United States, essentially curbside parking has been taken away from the curb and pushed out 10 feet into the roadway. So now the parking is over here. There is now a buffer between these parked cars and cyclists, so they're not vulnerable to dooring, and the cyclists actually ride in this high visibility bike lane, which is directly curbside. Now, you don't necessarily need to do this with car parking. You see here an example of this with planters. They also don't need to be single direction. So you see two examples here of bi-directional protected bike lanes using different methods. Now, that does require a lot of space. So more often than not, what you'll see out there are the good old-fashioned bike lanes. This is just paint on the roadway. These are super effective. It raises visibility so drivers know where to expect cyclists. It gives cyclists a safe, space of their own, so they're more likely to feel comfortable biking. One thing with these is, making them as visible as possible. So using highly reflective white paint is really important, and maintaining it over time. In higher density areas, what communities will do is create a solid reflective color. I've seen green, I've seen red, but again, this is meant for higher density areas to increase visibility. It does get expensive, so that's just something to keep in mind. That's another reason that you want to restrict this to higher volume roadway locations. But again, it's all about visibility and creating space for other uses. Now, so the lowest level of protection here is called a shared route. And these are delineated. So essentially the idea here is it's a lane that is meant for shared use. So cyclists are supposed to be able to take the lane just like a motorcycle would. You take center lane just like any other moving traffic. Now, these are delineated with what we call sharrows on the street and regulatory signage from one route to another. Now, these should never be at the heart of your bike network. Shared routes are intended to sort of A, be used on lower volume roadways, and B, connect more robust pieces of bike infrastructure where you don't have space for a full bike lane or a protected bike lane. So for example, if let's say if you have a bike lane on street A and you're trying to get to a trail on street C, street B is too narrow for a bike lane. So you're going to create a shared route from road A to road C in order to make that quick connection. So those are on-road bike facilities, and that's how bicyclists move. But equally important is where bicyclists are supposed to end up at the end of their journey, right? So anybody here who owns a bike wants to make sure that it's going to be safe wherever we're going before they decide to, make a trip via bike. So we need to make sure that we have bike parking at our key destinations in Johnson City. And what's great about bike parking is that it doesn't just need to have a functional, a single use purpose, right? So it's not just about parking bikes. You can have really creative bike racks. And I've seen this in Binghamton actually, where bike racks are actually sculptural. So what do I mean by this? Here you have a bike rack with Go Bike Buffalo's logo on it because they funded these bike racks in Buffalo. You see you've got an apple here, you've got a penny farthing. This is in Eastwood near Syracuse. And then you have these other really funky designs. And this is part of placemaking, right? So it when you're installing bike parking, it's not just about creating a space to park bikes. It can also be about community engagement. You can work with the local high school to create a design competition and actually put sculptural elements on the roadway that have a functional purpose. So we're checking off a lot of boxes. We're providing space for bikes to park. We're creating unique sculptural elements on our roadway, and we have an opportunity to engage the community in a really interesting way. And the ultimate evolution of bike parking is what's called a bike corral. This is essentially a parking space that is reallocated for bike parking. And I want to remind you what I said at the beginning here about highest and best use of public space. What is more efficient, a space that serves one car or 8 individual bicyclists? Just something to think about. And this is a tongue-in-cheek, on the nose version of that. These, like, decorative bike racks, these can also serve a unique placemaking function. So you see that this bike corral here has been painted in a really cool pattern to draw the eye, to increase visibility, but also it just creates a unique corner outside of this store. ADA accessibility is really critical. We could spend the entire webinar just talking about this, but needless to say, there are a lot of tools out there to help make our streetscape more accessible to those with different needs. So whether you have a mobility impairment, whether you have trouble seeing or hearing, it's important to think about these issues and make sure that we're addressing them so that our streetscape in Johnson City can be utilized for everyone. Streetscape and public art, we've already talked about this a bunch, but this helps us create that unique sense of place, but it also can help us with traffic calming. So studies have shown that street painting like this does tend to slow down vehicle traffic. So again, I hope the theme you're seeing here is that Complete Streets isn't just about single use. You get a lot of bang for your buck with a lot of these tools and strategies. Here's an example from Rochester. That this was called the Boulevard program. And again, it was a community engagement exercise where they picked some important intersections. You see this is outside of a park space. They created designs on the roadway and they implemented them for traffic calming and placemaking purposes. Here's another topic we could spend the entire webinar talking about, but Needless to say, there is an entire literal ecosystem of environmental considerations on the roadway, whether we're talking about stormwater runoff, whether we're talking about drainage and flooding, whether we're talking about street trees and shade. It's really important to think about the environmental impacts of our street space, our streetscape on the environment. And that is the infrastructure and design section. We have barely scratched the surface. So the toolbox that we were rummaging through is very deep. And I would encourage you to look at some of these resources to get additional inspiration that makes sense for Johnson City. So NACTO has a ton of really robust design guides, very visual, very easy to understand, to get a sense of different tools that are out there. If you're dealing with a state roadway or state-funded project, you want to look at AASHTO standards. This is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. That's typically the standard that they are looking toward for projects. And then if you're interested in freight, NYSERDA has this great guide that they wrote about freight mobility in New York City. And I recognize that a lot of stuff for the New York metro area is not necessarily going to be applicable in Johnson City, but I found that just reading about these things helps inspire different ideas. So I think it's worth taking a look at. So the moment everybody's been waiting for, let's take a walk. I've been given 3 intersections that we're going to do a quick virtual walk audit on. Now, I want to put out a disclaimer. Obviously, this is not as effective as an in-person walk audit where we can observe behavior from cars and other pedestrians. Also, there are things that I might not be capturing because the street view is old or I can't see something. So I'm doing the best I can with aerial imagery, and I freely admit that there are things that we are missing. Now, typically, what I like to do when we're on a walk audit is rate an intersection on a scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, 0 being terrible, 10 being great, and sort of talk about why it's not higher or why the score isn't higher or lower. So that's what I'm going to do here. The first street that I have in our walk audit is Main and Arch. This is our existing condition. If I had to rate this, I would give it a 3. I think there's a lot to be excited about here, but I think there's plenty of places to improve. So a couple things that I see. There are really wide pedestrian crossings at all 3 existing crossings, which brings me to my next point, which is there is no crossing on this roadway right now. So if you want to get from here to this park space, which is awesome, you have to go all the way around this intersection through 1, 2, 3 very long crossings. One thing I want to point out is that this is a great sidewalk. Well, pretty much all of these are great sidewalks. They're wide. They have these awesome brick decorative features that are really important for placemaking. But if you can't connect things well, then people are less likely to be walking on these different sidewalks. Another thing I wanted to point out, I think I've only seen this like once before. I think this is a Sharrow. So I know there are bike routes or bike lanes elsewhere, like on Arch Street. But here on Main Street and here on Arch Street, I found these interesting symbols. And my guess is that the point here is that this is the lane you should be in if you're trying to be on a bike route. That said, it's if you're not an urban designer and you're not familiar with the streetscape, this doesn't really tell you much about what your positioning should be, right? So should you be riding on the symbol? Should you be on the right side? Should you be on the left side? I see that this isn't a turning lane on Main Street, but it's this teeny tiny symbol. So is a cyclist, that's hugging the sidewalk or the curb, going to see this and know what they're supposed to do? So
Yeah.
Anyway, these are some observations.
Yep, Dan, this is Scott. Just to clarify, it came up in the chat too that that symbol is it's for the bike detector, so it's where it should be positioned to be able to for the light to sense the bicyclist there and activate the light.
I
and
see.
signal there.
I see. So I would say that it's great that it exists, but is this the most user-friendly design for a cyclist? Is this something that anybody would implicitly know approaching this stoplight? So that's a rhetorical question. We don't need to answer that. If I were to try to improve this intersection, a couple things I would do. One, I would shorten the crossings. I think, there's nice shoulders here where we could take advantage of them and, build out some painted curb extensions. I also think, and I'm not on the ground. I don't, I haven't done a study or I haven't seen the whole roadway. I think there is space for a bike lane, at least on some portions of Main Street, definitely on Arch Street. So I know this leads to an overpass. I think we have the space here, whether it's extending the sidewalk a bit and making it a shared use path or taking advantage of the side of the roadway. I would also say here, it was difficult for me to tell, I know there's on-street parking, so maybe changing up the way that these bike routes are delineated. So for example, instead of that symbol, maybe putting in a bike box. I know I didn't talk about this, but bike boxes are basically boxes at the front of a lane that enable cyclists to move in front of traffic and wait for the light. Maybe putting a bike box in there would be more useful and more visible in order to make this left turn. Just a thought. And I do want to put another caveat in here. This is not necessarily my professional design recommendation. Obviously, if I were redesigning your roadway, I would want to spend a significant amount of time actually on the roadway. The purpose of this is really just to get the juices flowing and inspire critical thinking about what the street can look like. I would also, if we are putting in curb extensions, I would add another crosswalk here in order to make this a four-way crossing. So moving on to Corliss, Lewis, and Jennison. If I had to rate this intersection, I would give it a 2 based on what I see here. However, Street View was kind and has shown us that these sidewalks and curb ramps have been updated to be ADA compliant, which is awesome. So I guess I would give it a 3. Couple things that I like. There's bike parking in front of the feeder. Also, it's nice to have that sort of civic space. Also, new ADA compliant curb ramps are a plus, but there are no crosswalks. There's no way to cross here. And it wasn't clear to me from this image if that was actually part of this project. So very simple. I would add in some curb extensions here to shorten the crossing and also square off the turn. So, I would imagine, and again, I'm not there to observe vehicles, but like these turns can look very different depending on who's driving and how they turn. Whereas if we create a very clear space and force drivers to make 90-degree turns, things are going to be a little more predictable. Adding visible crosswalks is really important, at least here on Lewis Street. It would be great if we could add mid-block crossings from the theater here over to this roadway. I imagine some of this parking is for this theater, but I'm not sure. But creating more ways for people to cross from one side of Willow Street to the other. And then lastly, given that this is a theater, and I imagine, I looked at the website, it looks like they're fairly active with different concerts and shows and things like that. This would be a really cool collaboration to have some sort of painted street mural, to slow down traffic here, to, sort of highlight the fact that this is a theater space, just something to think about. Last intersection I'm going to talk about here, I want to end on a high note. This is Jennison, Main Street, and Avenue A. I would give this a strong 7. I think there's a lot to like here, as you can see. So I love the fact that there are clearly painted parking stalls. I like that there are actual no parking spaces on either side of this driveway, so it creates more visibility. Again, that's that daylighting concept that we talked about. I'm again going to mention this brick sidewalk detail. This is a really great feature. I'm seeing accessible curb ramps. I'm seeing wide shoulders. I'm seeing really nice, robust commercial wide sidewalks. So this is a great intersection. Now, I will say maybe not as much for pedestrians. So my big criticism here is that there's no corner-to-corner crossing. And I get it. I get why it is the way it is. This is a challenging street geometry. So simply put, I think the only thing to really improve here, if we wanted to take this from, say, a 7 to like a 9 or a 10 even, is to shorten these existing crossings. You know, here you see I'm putting bump outs on either side of this existing no parking area, which is in turn shortening the Main Street crossing. And keep in mind, we're just taking advantage of this extra space here that would otherwise be for parking. Same here and here, and then adding a crosswalk here. You know, the last thing you want is to have to walk, you know, all the way from here to, you know, like do a full round in order to just cross the street. So I think it would be helpful to have a crossing at this corner as well, in order to make it more pedestrian friendly. So again, that's a very high level, quick run through of you know, a walk audit. I hope this was illustrative in sort of critically thinking about the streetscape. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to breeze through the policy section here. Now, I know Johnson City has a complete street policy, so I think the question here is, you know, what sort of things should we be looking out for to make it more effective and to ensure its longevity? So policies are really important because it's an official mandate to work towards an integrated transportation network and establish some sort of reporting framework for complete streets in our community. Now, if you have a good complete street policy, one of the things that you might do up front is build in a prioritization framework for different land use contexts. So this is from Albany's Complete Street Policy and Design Manual, and they do this work. They say, okay, in a downtown context, we're going to prioritize investments on principal arterials in pedestrian zones, transit lanes, turning lanes, bicycle zones, and parking zones. These are our primary focus areas on a principal arterial downtown. And this is great because it lays out what's important within different land use contexts. So think of this like that step ladder I showed you earlier in the design section. There are a lot of typical pieces you'll see in a complete street policy. So your vision is your definition of complete streets. Your policy intent is your mission and what you're trying to achieve. Scope of applicability is who this impacts and who we're trying to touch with this policy. Projects and phasing, so talking about where complete streets is going to be applied in different phases of project development. Exceptions is really important here, and this is where I see a lot of complete street projects fail. I'm sorry, complete street policies fail. If your exceptions are not, your exception criteria and process are not clearly laid out, it makes it very easy to ignore the policy altogether and just get exceptions to everything. So you want to make sure that when you do exceptions, you have crystal clear criteria for an exception. So these are allowable exceptions, and this is the process. It's not just a question of, you know, oh, if it meets these criteria, it's an exception. It's okay, you need to note these criteria, you need to send it to the planning board, it needs to be signed off by the superintendent or, you know, the chief of the Department of Public Works, and then you can have your exception. That needs to be clearly spelled out. Committing to an integrated transportation network. Again, we want to make sure that projects are not happening in a vacuum. So if we're working on complete streets in one part of town, we want to make sure we're connecting to those other projects. Design standards spells out where you're able to look. So you might have a local design standard with your Department of Public Works or Transportation Department, but a lot of these things aren't necessarily in your design standard. So allowing flexibility to look to things like NACTO and AASHTO, you want to have that flexibility to identify other designs that aren't necessarily in your regular design standard. We want to make sure that we're sort of keeping in character with Johnson City. We don't want to do something crazy out of context. We also want to make sure that we're doing the right treatments in the right place. Again, you don't want a protected bike lane on a super low volume roadway. It's just not a good use of money or time. Performance measures, this is really important. And I know it comes at the end here, but these are your goals. What are the things that you want to measure? What's important to Johnson City? And what are we trying to address with our complete street projects? And then lastly, implementation mandates. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where you really want to spell out, here's what we're going to do. In the next 5 years, we're going to, we're going to do an inventory. We're going to establish a complete streets public advisory board. We're going to create a strategic action plan for complete streets. This is where you put all of those things, to sort of set a work plan for this policy. You also want to note how often you're going to be revisiting these performance measures. One thing to think about are design packages that you can sort of fold into your policy. So school zones are a good example of this. What are the criteria for a school zone, and then what infrastructure treatments go along with it? So if you designate a roadway as a school zone, boom, suddenly you lower the speed limit, you put in speed bumps, you put in flashing beacons. It's very clear what a school zone means from an implementation standpoint. This is another example from New York City, neighborhood slow zones, similar idea, but it's baked in to a policy where if you are designated as a slow zone, suddenly the speed limit goes down, we put in signage, we put in speed bumps, etc., throughout this area. A couple resources for you on policy. So City of Albany, I mentioned this earlier, has a really great policy and design manual you should check out. Also, Smart Growth America has a complete street local policy workbook, which will help you sort of groom your policy and make sure it's meeting your goals. Implementation. So this is it, right? This is the dream. How difficult can it be, right? Well, let's think about it. So first and foremost, your Department of Public Works is ultimately going to be responsible for managing the roadway, doing any design changes, milling, etc. Unless it's state DOT, or even the county. Then you might have a transit agency operating on your main street, in which case a transit agency is going to be really concerned about where their bus shelters are, what they look like, how they're positioned, where they're pulling over to pick up passengers, and so on. Then you've got your businesses and the Chamber of Commerce. They're going to be really keenly interested in what you're doing as it's going to affect customers on the street outside of their business. And then you have a really diverse group of stakeholders, right? You've got cyclists, you've got elderly, you've got people jogging, you've got people shopping, you've got people in wheelchairs. All of these people have different perspectives and needs. So suddenly this idyllic complete street landscape has just gotten really complicated. There's a lot of people we need to talk to, and there's a lot of different needs we need to understand. So what's important in implementation is understanding how to bring these stakeholders together and who's responsible for what. And this diagram here, you don't need to read this, but what I want to point out here is this is from the National Guide on Bike Transit Integration, which I wrote for APTA. And this is specific to transit integration with bikes, or bike integration with transit. And basically what we did here was we took customer concerns, we translated them into technical issues, and then we talked about the role of each stakeholder in the process. So how do I get to transit by a bicycle? That's a safe routes to transit issue. And the transit agency has an influencer role. The public sector has a lead role. Private sector can vary, and advocates influence the outcome. So breaking it down like this and understand what the role of different actors is really important in order to achieve effective implementation. So generally speaking, in order to get to implementation, you want to restructure and update any existing plans you have after your policy is in place. You want to make sure that design guidelines are flexible, like I said earlier in the policy section. You want to make sure that everybody understands what you're doing. So this isn't just about general education. This is even on a project by project basis, making sure that staff and external stakeholders understand what you're trying to do and why. And then pilot projects can help you sort of cut through some red tape. We'll talk about that in a minute. And lastly, measuring performance both before and after is really key to a successful project, because we want to be able to say whether or not something was effective. Now, pilots, like I said, this is a way to sort of test ideas without a lot of red tape. You know, people are a lot more amenable to try different things when you say it's not permanent. So just give something a try. Also, you want to make sure that people feel like they can be engaged. So if you're, let's say if you're redesigning an intersection and you're doing it with temporary bollards and stuff, putting up lots of signage, with surveys and such to get people engaged, ask them their opinion, explain why you're redesigning the intersection. This is all really important. And also, if you get good data from a pilot, you can attract more funding for sort of large scale implementation. And then here you see Times Square. Anybody that's been there, within the last 10 years knows that Broadway's been shut down. And this has been extremely effective, and this started as a pilot. So what started as a pilot is not only permanent now, but has also spread up and down different parts of Broadway. Tag-along projects, are really important. So if you're doing a street milling in Johnson City, or maybe there's some utility work, if you do the upfront design work of redesigning your street, once a street is milled, it needs to be repainted anyway, right? So if you just have a different design, you just saved yourself a whole lot of cost in terms of capital staging and equipment. So think about these opportunities. Think about, if you have upcoming street milling, is there time to rethink the way that the roadway can be designed? There's a lot of myths out there about complete streets. So businesses get really concerned about taking parking away, but studies show us that the opposite is actually true. So businesses that abut complete street infrastructure see increases in commercial activity and customer satisfaction over time. Emergency services are always concerned about having access during times of emergency. And, a road diet can actually open up more space and create a more practical and predictable path for emergency vehicles. And you see an example of that here, right? 4-lane roadway converted to this. Suddenly, that turning lane becomes an emergency lane instead of, having everybody just sort of clamor to get to the side. Also, I should note, at least from a crash standpoint on the street, a road diet should make a safer street and therefore lead to less crashes, which therefore leads to less demand on emergency vehicles. Just something, to think about. We don't have the money for this. Well, like I said, with pilots, with tag-along projects, you can do complete street work without spending a lot of money. And then it just won't work here. Our community is too unique. Otherwise known as, we're not Davis, California, or Portland, or New York City. But as I've been saying all along, it's those unique elements about Johnson City which make complete street projects here very special, right? We don't want our complete streets to look like New York City. We want our complete streets to be uniquely Johnson City. So funding, there's a lot of different federal, state, and private sources of funding. I'm not going to take the time to go through these in detail, but I'd encourage you to talk to Scott and the folks at BMTS if you're interested in learning more about federal grants, since that's where federal transportation funding flows through. There are also CMAQ, there's Safe Routes to School, there's the Surface Transportation Block Grants, the statewide transportation improvement program. There's lots of different funding sources here. There's also state funding sources, so the CHIPS program, the Main Street program. You guys are in a waterfront community, so this one's not applicable, but again, there are state sources of funding for complete street projects. There are also smaller grants from philanthropic sources, so Rails to Trails has one, People for Bikes has one. You might also be able to get local sponsorship. So, you know, I know that you have some university development, so that might be an opportunity for streetscape improvements in particular areas. You know, the local hospital, maybe there's some other major employers that might be interested in investing in the community. From private sources, so no red-blooded property owner is going to give you money, most likely, for a street improvement, but you know, you might be in a situation where if you're trying to build a trail, you might be able to get an easement if you're going through, say, the corner of somebody's land. Business owners, similarly, if you can demonstrate a benefit to you know, their customers or employees, they might provide some funding. But again, easements are always welcome if you're trying to create, say, an off-street bike path. Developers, you have a lot of power with developers. You know, you don't want to overburden them because you do want to attract development in some cases, but at the same time, it's totally reasonable to ask a developer to make sure that all the curb ramps around the development are ADA compliant, or to fund, say, a gap in a trail that runs by the development. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here is pretty quick. It's evaluation. So there's a lot of things we can measure. Some are short-term measures, some are longer-term measures. When you're developing a data set, you know, it's important to prioritize the outcomes that are important to your community. And I said this up front, right? So it's not about putting in bike lanes everywhere and taking away parking. It's about achieving your goals and figuring out what tools you need to apply in order to do that. So what's important to Johnson City? Once we've determined what those key performance indicators are, that's when we start to develop a methodology. How are we going to count these things? How often are we going to do it? I skipped a step. And then establishing a baseline before you do any complete street projects is really important. We want to know where we are today so that when we implement complete streets, we see improvement. And then I already said setting a regular schedule. You want to make sure that you're doing this on a regular basis to make sure that the strategies you employ are effective. So a couple common indicators, which are more immediate terms. So traffic crashes is probably the most important one. You should be able to get this from your local police department in varying levels of granularity. So maybe you just have crashes, but if you have specific modal breakouts, that's really useful. If you're seeing a lot of car to bike collisions, then that tells us something about the types of design that we need in a particular area. Traffic volume is basically just how many bikes, pedestrians, or cars are moving through a given street. If you're at an intersection, you can look at vehicle turning movements. These you can do manually. There are also a lot of automated tools for counting these types of things. So traffic volume is probably your second biggest indicator that you often see with complete street projects. Traffic speed, again, you can measure this a number of different ways. One way is to go out with a speed gun and do your own study, or a speed camera, if you can do that sort of thing. As a proxy, if you don't have the resources to do that, you can look at speeding tickets from your police department and where they're occurring. So if you see clusters of speeding in any particular area, that's somewhere where we might want to consider some speed slowing design tools. Economic vitality is really important to measure. So you're not necessarily going to get a lot of transparency with businesses as far as their revenue is concerned, but you can look at sales tax receipts from businesses fronting complete street improvements. You can count how many people are in a restaurant street seating during the summer. You can do user surveys. You can survey business owners. You can also look at vacancies. So how many building permits are being issued or requested? How many storefronts are vacant? These are all good economic indicators. Now, I talked about most of those things that I just discussed are short-term indicators. So if you implement a complete street project, you might see immediate change. There are other big picture outcomes. So public health, public safety, environmental outcomes. These are things that tend to take a little bit longer to change. So, whether it's asthma and obesity rates, whether it's the crime rate or perceptions of safety, air quality, water quality, short of a COVID level event, air quality and water quality are going to take a very long time to change. Similarly, your crime rate may go down fairly quickly, but perceptions of safety do take a long time to change if you have like a historically, scary area in your city. Here's some tools and resources that you can look to for more evaluation. All good stuff, particularly this NYSERDA guide, measuring the impact of complete streets preliminary field testing. Definitely recommend you check it out as you're considering what KPIs are important to you. And just to review, active transportation is any self-propelled human-powered mode of mobility. Complete streets are streets for everyone. There are many tools, like a lot that we didn't even talk about. So I'd encourage you to look at those NACTO, AASHTO, and other guides. Complete Streets should seek to establish an integrated transportation network with different connections between various modes. Don't forget about freight mobility in your community. Complete Streets policies set the tone and establish guidelines for future street improvements. Implementation is complicated, but can be streamlined with cooperation education. And evaluation is critical to tracking success and setting community goals. So I apologize that I ran a little bit long, but I'm happy to stay on the call as long as other people can stick around to answer whatever questions are out there.
Well, thank you, Dan, for your presentation. If anyone would like to ask questions, I haven't gotten any specific questions in the chat box, but you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question verbally. Before I do that, there was a comment there that in the chat box that said that I'm sure BU students would also be willing to conduct studies or be involved in studies. And so, yeah, we definitely want to make good use of the Binghamton University. And I know I believe it's the geography department has already been quite involved in some of the studies going on for the Johnson City area. And yeah.
I go ahead. That there's some great examples of university collaborations here in New York State. So up in Plattsburgh, Clarkson University has been, they have partnerships with different community organizations and Creating Healthy Schools and Communities grantees, where they've sent students out to do sidewalk audits. They've collected all sorts of data to help with planning initiatives. So that's a tremendous idea and definitely something to think about, especially as the campus is expanding.
Okay, are there any questions that anyone has?
Will you send me a copy of this presentation?
Yes. So yeah, Dan's going to be emailing that to me. And so after this workshop is over, I'll be sending that presentation to everyone on the registration list, as well as a link to the video. And I'll also put some links on for some of the resources and tools, some of the design guides that were mentioned on the presentation as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, so I actually had a question. I guess partially a comment and also partially a question. I know in the beginning, it was sort of discussed how cars are quite expensive to own. And with what we're seeing today, I'm sure a lot of people would like a relief from the costs and burdens of car ownership. And I think one thing that's really important with like the walkable streets is that people may not need them. So is there any way so far where you've been working in workshops or implementing those that you ensure that some of the developments around those areas are reserved for people who may not or are just on the edge of affording a car, so that those people can take advantage of that system in some sort of priority? Because it seems like that's a good solution for a lot of people struggling with costs right now, is eliminating some costs of transportation.
Definitely. You're right on the money, and that's what we're working toward, right? So it's all about prioritizing different design issues in different areas. So let's say you have a low income housing development, right? You want to make sure, maybe it's not quite, maybe it's a little bit outside the walk shed of your main street. So you want to make sure that if transit is available, that there are really easy walking paths to transit, so that it's easy to access the hub of things. So, you know, doing that sort of analysis is really important to understand where those populations are. You know, it's easy for us to look at Main Street. I know I keep saying Main Street, but you know, that's the main street, right? So it's easy for us to pedestrianize Main Street and make it safer for everybody. But you're spot on the money. If people can't get to Main Street, those improvements don't do a lot of good for everybody. So as you go out in Johnson City and you start to think about areas where, let's say, we have public housing, or maybe we have more isolated student housing where students don't have cars, how can we make sure that we're creating that connectivity? So with student housing, you know, maybe it's making sure that there's ample bike parking and we're building robust bike paths. You know, because I know there's student housing that's going to go in relatively close to the main street. But if there's a farther away, say, public housing development, looking at transit routes, making sure that those transit routes are intersecting, like where are those transit routes closest to those housing developments, and how are we creating bridges and connections between the development and the transit route so it's easier to get there. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Anybody want to yell at me for the walk audit if I missed some stuff that's happening on the ground? I'll say this is a funny anecdote. The last workshop I did, I actually, in the street view, I was able to see tire marks, a lot of them hopping up on a curb. So even though we couldn't see traffic movement, I was able to confirm that a lot of vehicles are cutting, like physically running over the sidewalk in a particular area. So you guys know your community better than I do.
I actually did have one more question. I just looked back at my notes. So I know when we were going through and discussing some of the road diet options and some of the bike lane situations, you described like one of the bike lanes, which was just like kind of the painted path, like the dedicated painted path next to the road. Mm-hmm. And you classified that as safe. As someone who's biked around in, you know, some lanes similar to that, I'm not entirely sure if I understand your point, because in one of the pictures, it looked like there was a parking lane on the other side of it. And then also it looked like that biking lane could function as an informal shoulder. So are there any ways in which, when you're doing audits for these things, you seek to make the lanes a little bit less accessible for cars who might accidentally or purposely, you know, block those lanes or get into those lanes and strike a biker?
That's a great question. And, you know, again, we barely scratched the surface on all the tools, but especially bike tools that are out there on the street. I presented them I would say in order of protection. And there's a lot of wiggle room in between, say, a protected bike lane and a bike lane. So for example, you could have what's called a buffered bike lane, which doesn't have that physical separation, but has a bike lane and a painted buffer. I've also seen bike lanes that just have high visibility barriers, well, not barriers, like bollards, like the flexible plastic bollards just sort of bolted on the edge of the bike lane. So it's not creating a real physical separation, but it's creating a very visible separation between the cyclists and the drivers. So like I presented you with 1, 2, 3 on a spectrum, high, medium, and low, but there are other treatments. And I'd highly, highly, highly encourage you to look at the NACTO Bikeway Design Guide. Really, really great stuff in there. AASHTO also has the one I pictured on the screen there. That was AASHTO's bicycle facilities guide. So I'd encourage you to skim through that, because you're right. A bike lane in of itself is not the safest thing in the world as bike facilities go, but it does offer some protection in the sense of visibility and creates a use specific space on the street. That doesn't mean that bicyclists aren't vulnerable to dooring. It doesn't mean that cars won't double park in a bike lane, but at the very least, in most circumstances, at least there is a space that is specifically for cyclists on the roadway.
Thank you. That makes sense. And yeah, I'll be checking out that as soon as we're done here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Well, I think for time purposes, if there are any questions, you can certainly email them to me, and I can try to answer them myself, or if it's too hard, I'll go to Dan for some help there. But just want to mention too, before we sign off here, one of the comments that I get quite often is, well, our town is rural, we have rural roads, so we don't need complete streets policies. And I think just going back to what was mentioned earlier, that it's really about the context of the street. So, not all of us have busy downtown central business districts, but even in those rural areas, we need to consider, again, know your street, know who's using the street. Maybe there's issues with people having to cross the street to go to their mailbox, and there's a sight distance problem. So we need some warning signs up, or farm machinery. We need to make sure that there's warning signs for those, or the shoulders are as wide enough as possible for those who are biking or needing to walk, or for that farm equipment too. So basically know your context of your streets and design as much as best as possible for all the users of the system. All right, so I want to thank Dan again for giving us the presentation. A lot of good information there. And just a reminder that I'll be sending out a copy of the presentation along with the link for the video, and also some links to some tools and resources that'll be helpful as well. And again, BMTS is always available as well if you have any questions, or if there's certain projects going on that you'd like some input on. That's what we're here for as well. So thank you for your participation, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank you.